Welcome to this story, one of the most unsettling cases ever noted in the Arizona Territory. Before we dive in, share in the comments where you're tuning in from and the exact time you started listening. It's always interesting to see the different places and hours of the day or night where these stories reach. Let's begin. In the waning autumn of 1866, the Arizona Territory was still raw and uncertain, carved only 3 years earlier from the rugged southern lands of New Mexico. Beyond the reach of steady law, it drew both dreamers and desperados. Near a small rise east of Prescott, a narrow wagon track led to the Carter Homestead, a lonely cabin built by Henry Carter and his wife. Mary County plats record the property as 40 acres of mixed grassland and cedar scrub. Claimed under the new Homestead Act, the land was meager, the soil thin, but Henry believed he could wrest a living from it. Neighbors were few. The nearest settlement lay a full day's ride away, and travelers spoke of the stillness around the Carter place, how smoke from its chimney would twist and vanish faster than others, how the wind there carried a low hum after dark. The family had come west from Missouri that spring, bringing only a small cart, 2 mules, and a belief that isolation meant safety from the war's lingering chaos. A territorial clerk named Josiah Brent kept the earliest mention of the family in a Prescott ledger. H. Carter, age 37, homesteader. Wife Mary, 2 infants. Respectable folk. The entry feels routine, but later testimony turned it into a grim footnote. One of the clerks later recalled that Mary appeared withdrawn, as though unsure of the world around her. According to early settlers' accounts, some preserved, in the archives now linked with the Arizona Territory's early years, the land they chose had already carried a reputation. A prospector's journal from 1858 described the same valley as quiet yet unwelcoming, the air thick even when still. Folklore or coincidence, no one could say, but when the Carters arrived, even the nearest ranchers kept their distance. The first months passed without incident. Henry built a stone well, Mary planted corn near the stream bed, and neighbors occasionally passed by to trade salt and coffee. Yet those who visited spoke later of the strange silence inside the cabin. It was not neglect, wrote Reverend Milton Cobb, who stopped there during his circuit, but rather a house where words seemed unwelcome. When the year drew to a close, the Carter homestead sat beneath a hard, clear winter sky. The winds off the mountains carried dust that stung the eyes and filled the seams of doors. Mary Carter spent her evenings by the fire, sewing by lamplight while Henry worked the traps he set along the ridge. It was an ordinary life outwardly, but in recollections taken decades later, the sheriff's grandson wrote, "No one in that valley ever slept sound again after December of '66. By late November of 1866, the air in the high desert had turned brittle and sharp. Frost traced the edges of the Carter's cabin windows each morning, and the well water grew so cold it smoked when poured into the tin basin." Henry Carter spent most days reinforcing the barn and setting traps for coyotes that had grown bold in the thinning season. Mary, meanwhile, tended to the children and kept the hearth burning from dawn till nightfall. In the local trading post ledger, a brief note appeared beside Henry's name. Quiet man, no debts, wife pale, a small detail that would later haunt those who read it. The Arizona Territory was still young then, unsettled and mostly lawless, as described in territorial histories and accounts preserved from the era. Formal authority extended only as far as the constables could ride in a day. Most families depended on neighbors and faith more than on law. It was that same uncertainty, mentioned in early reports about the territory, that hung over the Carter homestead like a gathering cloud. Mary had stopped singing to the children that autumn. Samuel Hawkins, a nearby settler who delivered flour twice a month, told investigators years later that Mrs. Carter had taken to whispering hymns instead, the kind that sound like prayers for the dying. Hawkins's wife added another detail in her affidavit. She claimed Mary asked for extra candles, saying she didn't like to see the darkness pressed so close to the windows after sunset. The statement was filed in Prescott, though no further action was taken at the time. On the evening of December 3rd, Henry recorded the last known entry in his small field diary. Tracks again near the well. No sign of animals. Children say they hear tapping on the walls. That single page was later recovered from the ruins of the homestead, its ink blurred by water damage. Whether the noises were the result of shifting timbers or something more sinister remains unknown. Days later, a trader passing through claimed he saw a light flickering from the ridge above the Carter place, as though someone were waving a lantern. When he approached, the glow vanished. His testimony, entered into county records, described an odd hum like the wind turning inside itself. Henry dismissed it as nonsense when told, but Mary's expression, according to the same witness, drained of all color. Around mid-December, Henry rode to Prescott to collect supplies. When he returned 3 days later, the cabin door was open, and the sound of the wind inside seemed to echo unnaturally. Mary was standing near the fire, her hands still as if listening. "Did you see them?" she asked, though Henry never learned whom she meant. He found no footprints, no disturbance outside, yet Mary insisted someone had walked around the cabin through the night. The constable noted in his logbook, "Mrs. Carter unwell, claims unseen persons about the property. Husband skeptical." In a region already famous for its strangeness, confirmed in the same period's writings about the Arizona Territory, such entries often went unnoticed. The West was full of stories, and few had time to separate truth from rumor. But as the new year approached, neighbors began to speak in low voices about the Carter's place on the ridge, where even the crows refused to land. By the first week of January 1867, a heavy stillness settled across the ridge. The frost never seemed to melt, even under the brief noon sun, and the Carter cabin stood wrapped in silence thick enough to unnerve even the passing mail riders. Records from the territorial office later mention that only 2 families remained within a 10-mile radius that winter. Isolation had never been so complete. Henry Carter wrote a final letter to a cousin in Missouri around this time, one that would not surface until the 1890s, when it was found pressed between the pages of an estate ledger. In it, he described his wife as troubled by dreams she cannot separate from waking life. He went on, "She swears she sees a child by the well, though ours are both asleep. Sometimes she calls to him by name, though no such name is known to me." The language was steady, almost resigned, suggesting a man both practical and quietly terrified. Mary herself had stopped eating full meals. Hawkins's daughter, who once helped fetch water, told a journalist decades later that Mrs. Carter looked like she was waiting for someone who had already died. Her words, though second-hand, appear consistent with multiple references in the Arizona Territory's later compilations of settler testimonies, accounts that describe how psychological strain often blurred into folklore in those early years. It was during the coldest night of that January that the first verifiable disappearance occurred. Henry awoke to the sound of the door creaking open. He called out for Mary, then for the children. Only the youngest answered, crying. The older child's bed was empty, the blanket folded neatly, boots still beside the cot. Henry searched by lantern across the yard, his light swinging over bare soil and half-frozen mud. Just beyond the well, he found small footprints that led into the pines and simply stopped. At dawn, he rode toward Prescott to alert the constable, leaving Mary and the remaining child inside the locked cabin. The officer, Thomas Greeley, noted in his report, "Father in great distress. Wife described as near hysterical. Request search party, though road impassable." Greeley's report ended abruptly with the line, "Weather worsening, advise delay." The delay proved costly. When Henry returned 2 days later, he found smoke rising faintly from the chimney, but no movement inside. Mary was seated near the fire, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles had gone white. When he asked where the child was, she looked at him blankly and said, "He followed the same path." Henry's account, retold in court depositions from the following spring, was described as unreliable yet sincere. In the weeks that followed, no trace of either child was recovered. Henry buried 2 small wooden toys beside the well, carving initials into the surface before covering them with stones. Local gossip began to turn cruel. Some claimed Mary had harmed the children in a fevered trance, others that the family had been cursed by the land itself. The Arizona Territory's reputation for frontier tragedies, recorded later in historical overviews, only deepened as the Carter case grew into whispered legend. By February, the snow began to thaw, and travelers again passed near the ridge. One of them, a mule driver, reported hearing a woman's voice calling from the trees, repeating the same name over and over. When he followed the sound, he found only the cold remains of a small campfire, and a torn scrap of calico cloth. The thaw that came in late February of 1867 revealed more than new shoots of grass along the ravine. It uncovered what neighbors later called the quiet evidence. A pair of searchers from the Prescott Constabulary rode out to assist Henry Carter, though records note they did so reluctantly, as the trail had gone cold and the ridge was ill-favored. The men, Deputy Amos Lyle and tracker Josue Vega, arrived at dawn and found Henry outside the cabin, staring toward the tree line with the lantern still lit, though the sun was up. Lyle's report, preserved in the county archive, described the cabin as tidy, too tidy for recent grief. Mary Carter was inside, silent, sitting beside a covered cradle she refused to let anyone touch. When Vega glanced beneath the cloth, he found only a doll wrapped in an infant's quilt. The inventory of the scene lists no bodies, no blood, only the lingering smell of burned oil and damp wood. Henry insisted that the children had wandered away, but his hands shook when he said it. The investigators spent the afternoon combing the area. Near the well, Vega noticed soil that had been recently disturbed. When they began to dig, Mary screamed and fled toward the barn. Beneath the surface, they found a small collection of personal items: 2 tin spoons, a wooden horse, and what appeared to be a child's shoe blackened by fire. Vega halted the search, noting in his statement that the ground itself gave a sound like a sigh when opened. The comment, poetic as it was, made the official report read more like a confession than evidence. Later that evening, a storm rolled in from the west. Henry begged the deputies to stay the night, but they refused. They escorted Mary to Prescott for questioning and left Henry behind. The following morning, when they returned, the cabin was deserted. Inside, the fire still burned low, and a faint line of ashes led to the cellar door. Lyle's final note recorded, "The man vanished between hours of dawn and 7. Only footprints leading inward remain visible." Over the following weeks, the Prescott newspaper printed cautious updates under the heading "Tragedy on the Ridge." Some editorials cited the instability common to settlers in the harsh Arizona territory, where isolation, fever, and starvation often blurred into madness. The case, they argued, was less about violence and more about human frailty. Yet among the miners and ranchers who passed the Carter land, the whispers told a different story. They said that Mary's voice could still be heard near the spring at night, calling the names of her children as if summoning them home. By spring's end, a new family, Jacob and Ellen Fuller, bought the Carter property for a fraction of its worth. Within 3 months, they too had abandoned it. Ellen wrote to her sister in a letter preserved by descendants, "The place feels watched. Even the cattle avoid the well. There are marks on the beams that deepen each morning, though we scrape them away." In official records, the Carter file closed quietly in the summer of 1867, but in local retellings, it never did. One chronicler of early Arizona life, referencing the same territory's lawless years, wrote that every county has its ghost, and Yavapai walks with a lantern near an empty well. It was a fitting epitaph for a case the law could not explain and the desert refused to forget. Spring of 1868 brought new settlers to the ridges outside Prescott, but none stayed near the Carter land for long. The cabin still stood, its roof patched with uneven boards, the barn half collapsed from winter storms. Grass had grown through the cracks in the porch, and the well stones were dark with lichen. Travelers noted that the air there was oddly still, as though the wind itself hesitated before crossing the yard. The sheriff's log from that march recorded the site as abandoned yet not empty. A prospector named Elias Dorr was the next to trespass upon the property. Searching for quartz veins along the creek bed, he camped inside the cabin for 2 nights. On the 3rd morning, he arrived in Prescott pale and trembling, claiming he'd heard children's laughter under the floorboards. Dorr's account was mocked in the newspaper, but when a deputy went to investigate, he found the cellar door nailed shut from the outside. Inside the cellar were small impressions in the dirt, like knees or elbows pressed into soft soil. The report filed by Deputy Collings stated simply, "Traces found of unknown origin. Recommend sealing of property." The Prescott authorities, overwhelmed with territorial disputes and mining claims, did little more. The Carter homestead was left to rot, and for years afterward, no one dared dismantle it. A local pastor, Reverend Asa Turner, wrote in his journal that the house carried a heaviness that repelled prayer. Such language, though spiritual in tone, mirrored what the Arizona Territory histories would later describe as a psychological frontier, where hardship and solitude blurred the line between faith and fear. Mary Carter's name reappeared once more in 1872, when a woman matching her description was reported in Tombstone, then a growing mining town far to the south. Witnesses described her as middle-aged, refined, and carrying an old photograph case. She called herself Mrs. M. Kent and rented a small room near Fremont Street. Within weeks she disappeared again, leaving only the case behind. Inside was an image of 2 children, the plate damaged by scratches. On the back, faintly etched, was a single word: Prescott. The discovery reignited curiosity about the old homestead. That summer, a group of surveyors marking new boundary lines passed the property and found it partially burned. Only the stone chimney and a few iron tools remained. One of the men, William Pratt, later told a journalist that he saw what looked like a woman's shape through the smoke, standing near the well and fading as we approached. His account, though dismissed as superstition, circulated widely. In small towns like Prescott, where memory outlasted fact, such details soon became gospel. By 1880, the Carter tragedy had entered the oral tradition of the Arizona Territory. School teachers warned children not to wander past the ridge. Traders claimed their horses refused to cross the old wagon track after dusk. The Territorial Gazette published a reflective column that year, calling it a cautionary tale of distance, loss, and the peril of isolation. But among the settlers, the legend had taken on a darker life. Some said the well still whispered when the moon hung low, repeating names no one alive could remember. A decade later, when the first university scholars began collecting early Arizona folklore, the Carter homestead appeared again, this time not as tragedy, but as parable. It stood as a reminder, much like the official chronicles of the Arizona Territory itself, that the line between settlement and wilderness was never clean, and that not all ghosts wear sheets or chains. Some, they said, simply linger where the silence is deepest. By the early 1880s, the Carter property had become a landmark for all the wrong reasons. Survey maps labeled the area only as abandoned claim, and stage drivers pointed it out to passengers as a curiosity before urging their teams faster. The chimney still rose from the ruins like a warning finger, blackened by the partial fire that had consumed the cabin years before. A few wild roses clung to the porch posts, blooming each spring despite the neglect. In the fading light, travelers said the stones around the well caught the last sunbeam longer than any other place on the ridge, as if unwilling to let go of daylight. A retired deputy, Amos Lyle, the same who had once investigated the scene, wrote a letter to the Prescott miner describing his memories. He admitted the official inquiry had been hurried and incomplete. "We never found proof of harm done," he wrote, but the ground there did not feel honest. Lyle's recollection was quoted in several later histories of the Arizona Territory, lending reluctant legitimacy to the legend that refused to die. Historians of the era often pointed out how the region's mix of heat, solitude, and superstition produced tales that clung harder than facts. That same year, 1882, a team of rail surveyors set up camp near the ridge, while plotting a prospective spur line toward the Verde Valley. Among them was a young draftsman named Caleb Royce. His field notes, later preserved in a local museum, record a peculiar entry. At dusk, heard rhythmic knocking from below ground. Soil firm, no mining shafts nearby. Source unknown. Royce's pragmatic tone suggests he did not believe in hauntings, yet 2 nights later he left the site abruptly. His supervisor's log simply states, "Royce departed under agitation. No one ever learned what he had seen or heard." Around that same time, scattered reports placed a woman resembling Mary Carter in several mining settlements. She was always described as quiet, middle-aged, and carrying a small tin locket. Some claimed she worked briefly as a nurse at the Territorial Infirmary in Phoenix, before vanishing again. An orderly, quoted years later in an article on the Arizona Territory's early medical history, swore she spent nights sketching the outline of a well in her notebook. She said it called when the air turned cold, he recalled. No record confirms her real name, but the timing and description matched too closely to dismiss entirely. By 1890, the Carter story had become a cautionary fireside tale. Prospectors repeated it to keep children from wandering, and travelers told it as proof that the land itself held memory. Scholars later observed how such legends mirrored the state of the frontier, when human presence was still new and nature remained indifferent. One professor from Tucson, reviewing local folklore, remarked that the Carter account may be exaggerated, yet it reflects a real fear of silence in the early Arizona Territory. The ridge remained untouched for years afterward. Each spring, wind carried dust over the old foundation, smoothing out what little remained. But on certain nights, when moonlight struck the stones just right, some swore they saw the faint outline of a woman kneeling near the well, her head bowed as if in prayer or apology. Whether anyone truly saw her or only imagined they did, no one cared to find out. The road veered wider each year, and by the turn of the century, wagons no longer passed close enough to test the story's truth. At the dawn of the 1890s, the Arizona Territory was changing fast, rails pushing deeper, towns springing from dust, and the old frontier giving way to new ambition. Yet the ridge where the Carter homestead once stood remained curiously untouched. Travelers heading east from Prescott still used it as a marker, whispering that the land remembered things. By then, half a generation had passed since Mary Carter's name had appeared in any official record. Even so, her legend had outlived her absence. A territorial historian named Dr. Edwin Ransom, known for cataloguing early settlement tragedies, visited the ridge in 1893. His notes, later published in Frontier Studies of the Arizona Territory, offered a sober but unnerving description. The soil here is darker than that of the surrounding ground, as if fire and decay mingled beneath the surface. The well, long sealed, emits no echo when pebbles are dropped into it. Ransom concluded that superstition had preserved the site as effectively as any boundary law. His visit revived local discussion and inadvertently pulled the Carters back into print. That same year, a Prescott blacksmith named Daniel Fry reported finding an old trunk unearthed by storm runoff near the ridge. Inside were damp papers and a small leather-bound journal signed H. Carter. Only fragments were legible. One line stood out. "She calls for them again tonight, though I do not know to whom she speaks." The handwriting, verified by comparison with Henry's earlier land petition, matched. Fry turned the trunk over to the sheriff, but before an inventory could be taken, the papers went missing from the courthouse. Rumor held that a clerk took them home for safekeeping and later fled north when his dreams turned restless. In that same decade, a mining outfit tested the land near the ridge for silver content. The company's foreman, Robert Gage, later told an interviewer that one of his men unearthed a wooden beam carved with initials MC and a faint drawing of two small figures holding hands. They reburied it the same afternoon. Gage laughed off the story in public, but when the interviewer pressed him years later, he admitted the air smelled of candle wax and ashes that day, though the ground was dry. As the century closed, the Carter case became a favorite subject for penny serials and traveling lecturers. They exaggerated freely, adding bandits, ghostly lanterns, even hidden treasure. But the core of the tragedy remained recognizable. Old-timers shook their heads at the fabrications, yet none could entirely reject the underlying truth. Something had happened there that defied tidy record-keeping. The Arizona Territory's transformation into a state did little to erase its older ghosts. By 1900, the once feared ridge had grown over with mesquite and tall grass. Cattle grazed nearby, though herders noticed they would not drink from the well. One of them, a Navajo ranch hand named Jonah Key, later said, "The wind there hums like someone praying beneath the ground." His words were recorded in a 1905 folklore journal, tucked between studies of miners' superstitions. Whether Key had heard a sound or inherited a story, no one questioned him. On that land, stories were often truer than silence. As the century turned and rail whistles echoed through the valleys, the Carter homestead slipped further into memory. Yet its absence was presence enough, an empty space that locals instinctively avoided, as though fear itself had marked the soil. Even newcomers who knew nothing of the name would sometimes pause their horses near the ridge, glance at the well's dark outline, and ride on faster, unwilling to linger. In 1906, 4 decades after the events that emptied the Carter homestead, the Arizona Territory was finally approaching statehood. Telegraph poles marched westward, and rail stations brought families, goods, and gossip from the east. Yet in every tavern between Prescott and Jerome, the mention of Carter's Ridge still lowered voices. The story had become less a tale of murder and more a parable whispered around campfires, a warning about the cost of isolation. Some swore it was cursed ground, others said the land itself simply remembered grief. A schoolteacher named Clara Devine, newly arrived from Kansas, rented a small cabin nearby and recorded her impressions in a notebook later published in a regional journal. Her first entry read, "The locals refuse to take the road past the ridge. They speak of a woman who still waits by a vanished well. I think it folklore, though even the air feels watchful." She made sketches of the overgrown site. Only the stone chimney and a scatter of boards remained, but one drawing shows a shape beside the ruins, tall and faint, as if the graphite could not decide whether it belonged to shadow or memory. Clara's curiosity led her to the Prescott archives, where she found Deputy Lyle's yellowing reports. In her notes, she summarized the old case, observing how quickly it had slipped from lore to legend. She compared the Carter's ordeal to other frontier tragedies recorded in the Arizona Territory's early years, cases where loss blurred into myth because distance made truth unreachable. Her account briefly reignited public interest. The Prescott Evening Courier printed a feature calling it the Territory's longest haunting, though Clara herself rejected that term. "If there are ghosts here," she wrote, "they are made of loneliness, not vengeance." That summer, she convinced 2 ranchers to escort her to the ridge. The men cleared brush around the well's collapsed stones, uncovering an iron ring buried in dirt. When they tried to lift it, the ground beneath gave way, revealing a shallow pocket no deeper than a child's arm. Inside lay nothing but packed earth and a single button of mother of pearl. Clara took it as a souvenir, intending to display it with her notes. But within weeks she fell ill, describing whispers in the walls of her cabin before leaving town abruptly. Her brother, who collected her things, later told reporters the button had vanished from her desk. By 1910, the ridge appeared again on new survey charts, but only as an unnamed elevation. The younger generation knew it only through stories told by their grandparents. Yet even as progress swept across the territory, something about that tract resisted settlement. A developer attempted to buy the land for grazing rights but withdrew after laborers refused to clear it. One worker claimed to have seen footprints. In dry soil, another said his horse refused to cross the boundary. The foreman noted both incidents in his diary and concluded, "There is nothing there but air, yet the air itself feels occupied." When Arizona finally became a state in 1912, the Carter story faded from newspapers but endured in quiet retellings, woven into lectures, sermons, and cautionary tales of the pioneer days. To scholars reviewing the region's folklore, it represented the uneasy marriage between human ambition and the indifference of the desert. The official histories of the Arizona Territory mention it only briefly, yet for those who lived nearby, it was proof that memory can take root even when life cannot. The ridge remained silent as ever, holding its secrets beneath the dust. By the middle of the 1910s, the once wild Arizona Territory had entered the modern age, yet the Carter Ridge seemed frozen in another century. Prescott bustled with automobiles and electric lamps, but a few miles beyond its outskirts, the land still kept its silence. Cattlemen avoided the ridge altogether, calling it the still spot, while the younger folk dismissed the stories as remnants of their grandparents' superstition. But even skeptics admitted that the place carried an unnatural hush. Birds avoided the pines there, and the grass never grew evenly around the foundation stones. In 1914, a local historian named Professor Lionel Ashe from the fledgling University of Arizona undertook a survey of what he called vanishing frontier memory. His field notes, later donated to the Territorial Archives, devoted a full section to the Carter tragedy. Ashe traced the family's origins through land grants and probate ledgers, confirming that Henry Carter's claim had been legally transferred after his disappearance. He referenced the earliest reports of the Arizona Territory to explain the psychological strain settlers faced, where faith replaced law and silence replaced neighbors. It was a measured academic tone, but even Ashe admitted unease when he visited the ridge himself. "The air here feels heavier than elevation alone can explain," he wrote. Ash was accompanied by 2 students, both of whom later recounted that while mapping the ruins, they heard what sounded like a distant tapping beneath the soil. One of them, James Porter, swore the pattern matched a human rhythm. 3 slow knocks followed by a pause. The professor dismissed it as ground echo, yet that night he confessed in his diary that his sleep had been broken by dreams of someone climbing stairs that no longer existed. When his notes were published posthumously, these personal details were omitted, but locals preserved the story anyway, adding another layer to the Carter legend. A month after Ash's visit, a series of small fires swept through the foothills north of Prescott. Most were attributed to dry lightning, but one fire stopped abruptly at the ridgeline, leaving a ring of untouched grass around the old Homestead site. Witnesses described it as though the flames had skirted the area deliberately. The Prescott Journal-Miner reported the oddity in a brief column titled "Fire Spares Carter Ground." It reignited public curiosity for a few weeks, prompting renewed visits from townspeople and amateur photographers. None stayed long. Several later said that their plates developed fogged or blank, the images erased as if the light itself refused to record the place. By 1916, the last known survey of the ridge was completed. The team marked it as non-arable, poor drainage, and recommended no further development. After that, the site slipped quietly off official maps, absorbed by private ranch land and overgrowth. Still, occasional travelers wrote of strange sensations while passing near it, whispers mistaken for wind, or the sound of a bucket chain clinking where no well remained. Those accounts, scattered in letters and local columns, would become the final echoes before history closed its pages on the Carter name. Yet in that closing silence something endured. The ridge remained a pause in the landscape, a small defiance against time and progress. Locals still say that when twilight settles low and the air turns cold, you can feel the weight of unseen eyes, watching, waiting, remembering what the desert never chose to forget. By the early 1920s, the ridge that once held the Carter homestead had nearly vanished beneath layers of dust and mesquite. Only the top ring of stones from the well remained visible, half buried in silt. Prescott itself was no longer a frontier town, but a modest seat of the new state, proud of its progress yet haunted by what it preferred not to recall. Old-timers who had lived through territorial days sat on courthouse benches, spinning stories for anyone patient enough to listen. When they spoke of Carter's Ridge, their voices would drop, as if instinct demanded caution even in daylight. One of those men, retired mail carrier Isaac Rudd, gave a formal interview to a visiting journalist in 1921. His recollection was measured but uneasy. "I never saw no ghosts," he said, "but I'll tell you true, the horses hated that road. You'd feel their legs go stiff halfway up the rise. There was something in the ground made beasts nervous." The journalist later published his account in the Prescott Tribune, noting that folklore lingers where memory fails. The piece referenced early records of the Arizona Territory, suggesting that the Carter case reflected not haunting but history, a collision of hardship and solitude that the land itself absorbed. Around that same time, a real estate broker attempted to parcel the area for sale. Surveyors rediscovered the ridge and cleared brush to mark new boundaries. They uncovered remnants of a wooden floor near the old chimney base, still blackened by smoke. Beneath one of the planks, they found a rusted nail box containing several folded pages. The paper had yellowed, the ink nearly gone, but enough remained to decipher a name: Miss Carter. The fragments were turned over to the Yavapai County recorder, who described them as letters of confession or devotion. Unclear. No copies survive today, only a clerk's summary reading, domestic grief, mention of children, repeated phrase, "they would not sleep." The rediscovery of those papers revived interest among local historians. A small academic journal from Tucson printed an article titled "Echoes from the Carter Claim," comparing the case to other frontier disappearances across the former Arizona Territory. The author concluded that while superstition had preserved the tale, the emotional truth remained intact. Isolation had devoured the family as surely as starvation or fever. That article was reprinted in several southwestern newspapers, briefly turning the Carter story into a symbol of the state's darker heritage. Yet visitors who went seeking the ruins returned unsettled. One young couple, newly married and camping near the ridge, claimed to hear soft knocking around their tent at night, like someone tapping on canvas with bare fingers. They left before sunrise, abandoning their cookware behind. Another group of travelers in 1924 took photographs of the site, but when developed, the images showed a faint white blur between the well and the chimney stones. The photographer, a skeptical newspaperman, destroyed the negatives the next day, writing only, "The light behaved wrong." Through all these renewed curiosities, the Carter Ridge remained unclaimed. Local ranchers fenced around it rather than through it, saying the soil turned their cattle restless. The new generation of children, unaware of names or dates, still heard their elders say, "Don't go near the old stones after dark." For them, it was no longer about Henry or Mary or the vanished children. It was about the shape of fear that lingers long after the facts are gone. And so, half a century after the first shovel struck the hard ground of that lonely claim, the desert reclaimed what the Carters had begun. Wind erased their footprints. Dust filled their hearth. But when the night wind rises from the valley, old ranch hands swear they hear faint laughter carried with it, thin, echoing and distant, like memory itself refusing to rest. By 1930, Carter's Ridge had become an unmarked scar on the map, known only to surveyors and a handful of locals who still remembered its exact bend in the trail. The Great Depression had driven families back to the land, yet even those desperate for acreage avoided the ridge. "Soil won't stay settled there," one ranch foreman told a government assessor. "You can plow it straight and come back next week." And the furrows have drifted crooked again. The comment appeared in an agricultural report, a brief bureaucratic echo of the fear that had shaped the area's legend for more than 60 years. A federal relief crew tasked with cutting new fire breaks near Prescott passed through the region that same year. Among them was a photographer, Lewis Harlan, assigned to document rural recovery projects for the Works Progress Administration. His surviving negatives, now archived in Phoenix, include a single frame labeled Old Homestead Site. The image shows cracked earth, half-hidden stones, and in the distance a shadowy blur that some interpret as a woman's outline. Harlan never mentioned it in his notes, but colleagues later said he refused to photograph the ridge again, muttering that the lens doesn't like that place. The reappearance of the site in official photographs stirred renewed curiosity among historians compiling Arizona's centennial retrospectives. One essay revisited the Carter tragedy as an emblem of frontier isolation. Its author cited early records of the Arizona Territory to underscore the danger of solitude in those formative years, how psychological unraveling often preceded violence. "Whether the Carters died by their own hands or vanished to the wilderness," he wrote, "the land remembers what paper forgets." The line became one of the state's most quoted reflections on its darker past. Local folklore collectors began gathering oral accounts from elderly residents. A former miner, then 82, recalled that his father once met a woman wandering near the ridge in the 1870s. She carried a small mirror and kept asking what year it was, he said. When told, she wept like she'd been gone too long. The interviewer considered it a conflation of memory and rumor, but noted the story matched descriptions of Mary Carter's reported sightings decades earlier. By 1934, the old wagon road had been rerouted entirely, bypassing the ridge by nearly a mile. Brush swallowed the last visible landmarks. Even the well, once a hollow warning, filled with dust and sage roots. But that same summer, a lightning storm ignited wildfires across Yavapai County. When the flames died, aerial photographs showed a peculiar pattern. The ground over the ridge remained untouched again, a pale circle of safety amid blackened hills. The local paper revived its old headline, "Fire Spares Carter Ground Once More." The event drew reporters, but none could explain the anomaly. A soil expert later claimed the area contained a natural pocket of mineral-rich clay that resisted combustion. Yet ranchers who lived nearby whispered another reason. The earth had already burned once long ago and refused to do so again. As the decade closed, Carter's Ridge slipped quietly back into obscurity. Progress passed it by, and the people who still remembered the Carters did so in fading voices, their stories soft as dust. Yet every so often, a traveler pausing on the highway swore they heard the faint ring of metal on stone, a sound like a bucket striking the lip of a well long since buried. Whether wind, chance, or something older, no one dared linger to find out. The 1940s brought the stir of a new world, yet Carter's Ridge lay dormant beneath its quilt of sage and dust. Soldiers returning from war found Prescott changed. Electric signs over Main Street, new automobiles groaning up the hills, but the ridge, a few miles north, still carried the same hush it had worn since the 19th century. The county line now cut through the outer edge of the property, but even the surveyor's chalk marks faded faster there, as if the land refused to be divided. In 1942, during preparations for a wartime airfield expansion, a geological crew revisited the ridge to test its foundation. The supervising engineer, William Pennock, later filed a report describing an area of unstable resonance. When his men drove metal stakes into the ground, the vibrations produced faint echoes, long, hollow, and rhythmic. The team chalked it up to subsurface air pockets, but Pennock privately recorded a different thought. There are layers beneath the ridge that respond like breath. His notebook, preserved by his granddaughter, added another eerie footnote to a story already saturated in them. The same year, the Arizona Historical Quarterly published a retrospective on early settler tragedies. Among the cases re-examined was the Carter Homestead, summarized as a mystery of isolation and mental collapse. The author cited sources drawn from early Arizona Territory records, including the sheriff's first reports and letters between frontier families. He mentioned how grief and loneliness often birthed local legends. Then, mid-article, he described visiting the ridge himself. "It is difficult to stand there without feeling that someone expects an answer," he wrote. That line alone revived public curiosity. Soon after, young servicemen stationed near the airfield began visiting the ridge out of boredom or bravado. Most returned laughing, unimpressed, though a few came back quieter. One corporal wrote in a letter home that the place smelled of rain when the sky was clear. Another said his compass needle spun slowly in a circle when set atop the wellstones. These anecdotes, published later in a small veterans newsletter, renewed the Carter legend for a new generation. By 1947, the ridge appeared again in a different light, this time as a subject of art. A regional painter, Elsie Rowan, produced a series of oilworks titled Whispers from the Ridge. Her most famous canvas shows a woman's outline blending into desert haze, a bucket chain coiling at her feet. Critics praised its ambiguity. Locals recognized the story immediately. Rowan admitted she had visited the site only once, sketching in near darkness. "I wanted to see how silence looks," she said in an interview, and it looked like her. The painting later hung in Prescott's small museum under the label Mary Carter, so 1866, artist's interpretation. Through the following decade, stories about Carter's Ridge drifted between folklore and fact. Teachers mentioned it in lessons on territorial history. Travelers turned it into a roadside anecdote, yet the ridge itself remained untouched. When a highway crew surveyed the area for possible extension in 1949, they decided to reroute rather than cut across the rise. The supervisor's margin note said only, "ground not worth disturbance." By century's midpoint, nearly 80 years after the first screams faded into those hills, Carter's Ridge existed somewhere between myth and memory. Children still dared one another to ride there at dusk, though few ever did. Those who went claimed they heard the soft clang of a well bucket, faint as breath, before the wind picked up and sent them racing home. The 1950s arrived with asphalt highways, neon diners, and new optimism. Yet the ground around Carter's Ridge stayed stubbornly in the past. Prescott expanded southward, drawing tourists to its mild summers and mining town nostalgia, but no one tried to build on the ridge itself. By then, the place had been fenced off by a ranching cooperative that listed it simply as unfit for grazing. The soil remained dry, uneven, and untrustworthy. What little grass grew there was coarse and colorless, bending in a different direction than the wind. In 1953, a small archaeology team from Northern Arizona University conducted a preliminary dig along the outer edge of the ridge. Their intention was to document early settler foundations for a local exhibit. The Carter site appeared on their maps under a generic code, YV22B. What they found made even the skeptical faculty uneasy. Beneath 6 inches of hard-packed clay, they uncovered a circular arrangement of stones with black residue inside, as though from repeated burning. At the center lay two rusted metal spoons crossed in an X. One of the students, a veteran named Frank Lopez, recorded in his field diary that the air grew so still it pressed the breath from the lungs. Their professor ordered the excavation filled before nightfall. The find was briefly mentioned in a local newspaper, which described it as evidence of domestic life during the territorial period. Privately, the team discussed the unease that followed. Equipment malfunctioned. A camera jammed. A tire went flat, though untouched by nails. The lead researcher later admitted in an interview that she felt watched. It wasn't fear, she said, just the sense that the land wanted to be left alone. Within months, university funding for the site was withdrawn. The ridge fell quiet again. By 1957, Carter's Ridge had taken on a new cultural role, featured in a regional radio series called Desert Legends of the Old Territory. The dramatization blended fact and rumor. Mary Carter portrayed as both victim and revenant, her voice echoing through static-laced airwaves. Listeners wrote to the station, claiming that the broadcast caused strange interference on their radios whenever it aired. One technician swore the transmission tower crackled, even when powered down. Whether coincidence or folklore reborn, the effect renewed the legend's reach far beyond Yavapai County. During that decade, the Arizona Historical Society released an updated volume on the state's early frontier period. The Carter tragedy appeared only in a footnote, a passing mention under unresolved settler disappearances. The text drew again from the earliest reports of the Arizona Territory, highlighting how countless families vanished or scattered before census records solidified. But the editors could not resist adding one line of speculation. If any site in the state embodies the unfinished grief of its pioneers, it may be the ridge once belonging to the Carter family. Local residents said that line felt truer than any map. Each generation seemed to inherit a little of that unfinished grief, passed quietly from parent to child. Even those who claimed disbelief would quicken their step if they found themselves near the ridge at dusk. By the close of the 1950s, the old chimney still stood like a memorial, its edges softened by time but its presence defiant, a sentinel watching over nothing but wind and rumor. And when night settled thick across the high desert, that wind sometimes carried a sound older than the century itself, a rhythmic creak, like a bucket chain swaying unseen, marking time for a story that refused to end. The 1960s brought modernity to Arizona, television antennas sprouting from rooftops, tourists chasing Route 66 romance, but the ridge north of Prescott never changed. Locals said progress had passed it by on purpose. The narrow county road still curved a half-mile short of the site, ending in a gravel turnoff choked with weeds. Hunters used it as a landmark, but even they admitted an odd quiet hung there. No coyotes, no crickets, just wind like someone whispering, one wrote in his journal. To most residents, it was an old story, a relic from the era when the Arizona Territory was young, yet the legend refused to fade completely. In 1962, a documentary crew from a Phoenix television station arrived, planning an episode on haunted corners of the West. They brought modern cameras, tape recorders, and bright portable lights. The footage survives only in fragments, but the surviving log lists one curious note. Audio interference begins 200 yards from ridge. Low mechanical hum continues throughout. The crew interviewed ranch hands and schoolteachers who recited the Carter tale like scripture. One elderly woman remembered hearing her grandfather describe the well as a mouth that swallowed sound. Another, younger voice broke in to insist it was just superstition, yet when the lights failed one by one, they packed up before sunset and never aired the segment. Around the same time, a Prescott High School teacher named Harold Eckers began collecting local legends for his students. His slim, self-published book, Ghosts of the Arizona Territory, treated the Carter case as moral allegory rather than haunting. He cited early county ledgers and the first law records of the Arizona Territory, explaining how settlers often projected grief onto the landscape. Still, Eckers admitted the ridge unsettled him. In an afterword, he wrote, "I stood there for an hour at noon. Nothing moved. Even my own shadow felt reluctant." The passage, quoted later in newspapers, became the line most associated with the story for the next 20 years. In 1967, exactly a century after the last official mention of Henry Carter, a regional preservation group petitioned to designate the ridge as a historical site. The proposal failed. The land had no remaining structures and belonged to a private rancher who refused entry. "That ground don't rest easy," he told the committee. "Let it stay empty." The minutes of the meeting record laughter, but none of those present returned for a second inspection. By the decade's end, the ridge had entered popular folklore rather than history. Musicians referenced it in ballads about frontier loss, poets used it as a metaphor for silence, and road trip writers treated it as a phantom waypoint, an address that existed only in rumor. Yet older residents still warned travelers to keep moving past the curve where the gravel meets the sage. "If you stop there," they'd say, "you might start listening too closely." When the moon rose thin over that stretch of desert, truckers swore their radios crackled with faint static, forming almost words beneath the music. Some said it was just the hills echoing distant signals. Others insisted it was the Carters, their story looping forever through the wires of modern Arizona, whispering reminders that no progress, no light, ever truly erases the dark corners from which a place was born. The 1970s turned much of Arizona into a landscape of motels, shopping plazas, and restless travelers chasing the mythology of the West. Prescott's population nearly doubled, and with new suburbs creeping outward, even the old dirt road near Carter's Ridge saw sporadic traffic again. Yet the ridge itself remained untouched, its fence rusted, the weeds thick, the chimney a dark tooth against the horizon. Developers surveyed the surrounding hills for vacation properties, but drew their blueprints just short of the rise. One planner later told a journalist, "It looked fine on paper, but the ground didn't feel right underfoot." In 1972, a graduate student from Tempe named Sarah Lynn visited the ridge while researching a thesis on frontier family disappearances. She arrived in summer heat and wrote in her field notes that the silence here feels pressed flat, like air that's been held too long. She examined the surviving records from the old Arizona Territory, constable's logs, property deeds, and stray newspaper clippings, then compared them to local testimony. Her analysis concluded that the Carter case was an example of environmental isolation manifesting as community myth. Yet, in a postscript added weeks later, she confessed to an experience she couldn't classify. "While sketching the site, I heard a faint lullaby. It came from nowhere and stopped when I moved." The passage never made it into her published work, but the note survives in the university archives. That same year, an oil painter named Carl Dent exhibited a series titled Still Voices of Yavapai. One canvas depicted a crumbling homestead under a high white moon. In its corner, a figure of a woman appeared only half painted, the rest fading into the dust-colored background. When questioned about the inspiration, Dent replied, "Some stories paint themselves. You just listen long enough." Critics praised the series for capturing the spiritual residue of the old Arizona Territory. Locals understood exactly what ridge he meant. During America's bicentennial celebrations in 1976, the Carter legend briefly reappeared in print. A Prescott newspaper ran a feature on early settler folklore, citing the ridge as the region's oldest unresolved mystery. The writer referenced early accounts of the Arizona Territory to anchor credibility, describing how the tale endured because the land keeps telling it. Readers sent letters debating whether Mary Carter had gone mad or vanished into the desert. One elderly woman claimed she was a descendant and begged the paper to let them rest. The editor obliged. No follow-up was ever published. By decade's end, only thrill-seekers and local teens ventured near the ridge. They brought flashlights and tape recorders, hoping to capture whispers or cold spots. Most came back disappointed, yet a few returned pale and wordless. One boy left a note on the courthouse steps. "Heard her call my name, but she doesn't know me." His family moved away soon after. The chimney still stood through those years, casting its crooked shadow over nothing but weeds. In aerial photographs from 1979, it appears as a small mark amid endless tan earth, proof that memory, even when reduced to stone, can resist erasure. Locals said the ridge slept through modern noise, waiting for someone patient enough to listen. And on certain still evenings, when the sun dipped behind the Bradshaw Mountains, a soft metallic creak could sometimes be heard, steady as breathing, the sound of an old chain, swaying where no well remained. The 1980s found Arizona glittering with desert resorts and interstate traffic, yet that silent ridge north of Prescott lingered like an unhealed scar. The county had changed almost beyond recognition. New schools, neon storefronts, paved roads, but when locals gave directions, they still said, "Past Carter's turn." Nobody had to ask what it meant. Even newcomers felt the hesitation when their tires crunched over that stretch of gravel where the road bent toward emptiness. In 1981, a regional historian named Patrick Monroe began producing a series of short television segments called Forgotten Corners of Arizona. Each week he featured an obscure ghost town or pioneer ruin. When he reached Carter's Ridge, the broadcast drew record viewership. Monroe walked the site at midday, camera crew in tow, the chimney behind him stark against the sky. His narration summarized the case much as the early records of the Arizona Territory had done. A family vanished, a homestead abandoned, a mystery unsolved. But mid-shoot, the microphones caught a faint metallic echo. 3 taps followed by silence. Technicians later dismissed it as interference from mining equipment miles away. Yet the raw audio circulated among locals for years, passed like contraband proof that something still moved beneath the soil. That same summer, developers again surveyed the land for potential vacation cabins. A Prescott contractor named Don Halley filed an application to clear brush and grade the site. His bulldozer stalled twice without cause, and when the engine finally started, a hydraulic line burst, spraying oil over the ground. The mechanic who repaired it later said, "I've worked 20 years in this county, and machines don't fail like that unless they're told to stop." Halley abandoned the project within a week, citing unreliable terrain. His permit quietly expired. By the mid-decade, the Carter story had slipped into academic obscurity again. Only librarians and folklore students revisited it, piecing together newspaper fragments and dusty ledgers. One such researcher, a young woman named Elena Shaw, compiled a timeline of the family's disappearance. Her paper concluded that the Carter tragedy persists because it mirrors the state's transformation, how wilderness swallows what civilization forgets. She quoted early descriptions of the Arizona Territory as evidence of how frontier suffering bred its own mythology. Ironically, she wrote that final section after visiting the ridge herself, describing the odd sensation that someone stood behind me, though the air was still. In 1987, a wildfire swept through the surrounding hills, the largest since 1934. Reporters noted the same phenomenon documented generations earlier. The flames stopped short of the ridge. A pilot photographing the containment line described a perfect oval of untouched ground, pale against the black. Local radio revived the old headline, "Fire spares Carter ground again." It became a half-joking phrase across Yavapai County, though few laughed when standing there. By decade's close, Carter's Ridge existed mostly in whispers, a crossroads between history and something older. Children growing up nearby learned to repeat the story on sleepovers: the lost family, the buried well, the ghost who hummed through static. Parents dismissed it as folklore, yet no one built there, no one picnicked, and no one lingered after dark. Some places, they said, choose their silence and keep it. And when the evening wind swept through that small forsaken rise, it carried a rhythm faintly metallic, patient as a heartbeat, 3 soft knocks, waiting for someone who never comes back. By the 1990s, Prescott had grown into a picturesque mountain town, its downtown framed by antique shops and polished brick facades. Tourists strolling Whiskey Row snapped photos of Victorian storefronts, unaware that barely 10 miles north, the desert still held ground too old for postcards. Carter's Ridge, by then, appeared only on obsolete survey charts and folklore maps. The road leading there had eroded into a track of stones and sagebrush, marked by a rusted fence that ended in nothing. A few teenagers still visited on dares, but even they admitted that it's not fun scary, it's quiet scary. In 1992, the Yavapai Historical Society organized an exhibit celebrating 125 years of settlement. Among the displays sat a small glass case labeled "The Carter Homestead, Mystery of the Arizona Territory." Inside were yellowed reproductions of Henry Carter's land patent, a blurred daguerreotype believed to show Mary, and a brittle newspaper clipping titled "Tragedy on the Ridge." The curator, Dr. Helen Cross, later recalled how visitors lingered longer at that case than any other. "It was the only story without an ending," she said. People kept waiting for the next card to explain it. Later that same year, a pair of hikers from Flagstaff reported finding fragments of old timber near the ridge while following a dry wash. They sent photographs to the local paper, nothing more than splinters and rusted nails. But the editor recognized the coordinates and ran the headline, "Remnants of the Carter Cabin Rediscovered." Archaeologists quickly debunked it. The wood matched a 1930s cattle pen, yet the attention rekindled old rumors. Locals began leaving small offerings, coins, dried flowers, scraps of fabric, at the fence post nearest the site. A quiet ritual meant to keep peace with the ground. A Prescott radio host named Tom Darrow capitalized on the renewed curiosity. In 1995, he aired a late-night special called Echoes from the Ridge, blending archival research with dramatized narration. Midway through the broadcast, his equipment picked up a faint metallic tone. Darrow joked about Mary calling in, but the sound persisted for several seconds before cutting to static. Listeners flooded the station with calls, some claiming they'd heard words under the interference. Audio engineers found no technical fault, but the tape segment was mysteriously erased during transfer. The following week, Darrow returned to regular programming. Ending his last mention of the topic with a dry chuckle, "Some stories edit themselves." That autumn, an amateur historian attempted to visit the ridge under moonlight to record ambient sound for a local documentary. His logbook later described the experience: wind mild, air cold, heard faint tapping like chain against stone. Equipment batteries drained simultaneously. His footage, grainy and half-lit, captured nothing conclusive but preserved the same sound, the hollow metallic rhythm that generations had sworn by. By decade's end, the ridge once again slipped into stillness. The county approved a nature preserve boundary that technically encompassed the area, leaving it protected by bureaucracy and neglect. It became a blank space on official maps, neither private nor public, an unspoken pause between property lines. At night, those living closest swore they still caught echoes on clear evenings. Not screams or wails, just the pulse of something mechanical yet human, patient as breathing through iron. It was, they said, the desert remembering in its own slow language, the rhythm of a family, a house and a well that time refused to bury completely. As the 21st century crept across Arizona's high country, Prescott entered another era of renovation and renewal. Cafes replaced saloons, hiking trails cut through once-forgotten canyons, and the past was repackaged into heritage tours. But Carter's Ridge remained immune to reinvention. The land was now technically part of a conservation zone, its coordinates omitted from public brochures, its fences half swallowed by sand. Travelers passing along the new highway saw only a stretch of barren hills and the faint outline of a chimney dissolving into the skyline. Few realized they were looking at the last trace of a mystery that had outlived the people who began it. In 2003, a university research group from Tucson recorded oral histories from rural families whose ancestors had settled during the territorial years. Among dozens of interviews, 3 unrelated elders mentioned the Carter's ground. Each spoke in the same slow cadence, describing the ridge as if it were alive. One woman said her grandmother used to stop her wagon there to pray for the lost mother. Another recalled his father warning, "That soil listens, so don't speak carelessly." The transcripts, archived under the state's folklore project, cited the Arizona Territory as the origin of the story's enduring weight, a reminder that even academic cataloging could not reduce it to fiction. The following year, a preservation photographer, Dana Hensley, received a grant to document abandoned structures across Yavapai County. She found the ridge by accident, chasing sunset light along an unmarked trail. Her photo, later exhibited under the title Carter's Ridge at Dusk, shows only stones, dead grass, and a slant of fading gold. Yet viewers swore they could see a figure near the well's shadow. Hensley dismissed it as pareidolia, but privately admitted in an interview that her camera shutter clicked 3 times on its own before I pressed it. She never returned. By 2010, nearly a century and a half after the Carters vanished, only fragments of the legend survived, blurred photographs, contradictory testimonies, and the persistent sound of metal on stone whispered through local tales. Prescott's schoolchildren studied the Arizona Territory as history now, but the Carter case appeared only in a single sentence on page 212 of a regional textbook. A family reportedly disappeared under mysterious circumstances north of Prescott, 1866. The simplicity of that line belied the centuries of unease it had left behind. Yet those who live near the conservation boundary still tell quieter versions of the story. Ranchers speak of headlights flickering when they pass the old road. Hikers describe hearing soft humming when wind cuts through the mesquite. And every few years, someone claims to see a woman standing by the stones at twilight. Her face indistinct, her figure caught between shadow and dusk. No one approaches. The ridge itself seems content with its silence. Grass now hides the cellar mouth. The chimney leans and time continues its slow reclamation. But when storms roll in from the mountains and the air turns metallic, the desert still speaks, not in words but in rhythm. 3 dull knocks, a pause, then one final echo that fades into nothing. Whether it is wind, memory, or something older than both, no one can say. What remains certain is that the Arizona Territory's oldest mystery never left its ground. It only learned how to wait.